right, we are back. Great ad from our very own David the Menzo in Menzies. And I'm here with someone who doesn't need a reminder to wear a suit when he comes on the live stream. This is Freedom Convoy lawyer Keith Wilson. Keith, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
Dress very well, Keith. All right, your general thoughts from today, what we've seen so far, and then we'll move on to the examination of Global Affairs Canada.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's been a repeat of what we've seen over and over again, which is each official that is brought forward is asked what they know about the factual evidentiary circumstances that would justify the invocation of the Emergencies Act, the stripping of Canadians' rights, the allowing the federal government, as the Emergencies Act does, to intrude into provincial jurisdiction. And each witness gives the same answer. There was no justification. They give it with precision, as you've talked about with Tom Razzo, but they confirmed that there was no national security threat. They agree that the sources with best information that would know if there was a national security threat was the OPP and other police organizations, and they acknowledge that their testimony is that the criteria to invoke the act wasn't there. So it's just becoming clearer and clearer, and it's going to be interesting when the politicians get up because they've really got nowhere to run and nowhere to hide.
Yeah, can you just remind us quickly? I know we talked about it at the beginning of the live stream. I read Section 2 of the CSIS Act. What threshold needs to be met for the Emergencies Act to be justifiably invoked?
Well, there has to be a serious threat to the national security. It has to involve acts of real violence. There has to be a credible plan for some overthrow of the government, an illegal overthrow. And there's Section 2 of the CSIS Act that refers to this new term that the government's come up with in recent years of ideologically motivated violent extremist. And the only ideologically motivated violent extremist that I've met in the last year has been the Trudeau government, and they've demonstrated their violence on Canadians by beating them and trampling them with horses in support of their ideology that the state knows best and Canadians' rights shouldn't be respected. So it cuts both ways.
No, of course. And I think that even today at the commission, the lady who was trampled by RCMP horses during the Freedom Convoy was here today. We saw her.
Right.
Yeah. So while we were doing the live stream at the beginning, Global Affairs Canada testified in front of the Public Order Emergency Commission. And Brendan Miller even got the chance to cross-examine the two witnesses who were on stand. So I think that you were still at the commission. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. It was still going on while you guys went live. And the senior official with Global Affairs Canada, so this is like, they used to be called Foreign Affairs, right? So they're dealing with embassies and relations with other nation states. And she said some remarkable things, and I was very glad that I wasn't sipping my coffee at the time because I probably would have spit it out. One of the things she said was that they were extremely concerned about the economic impacts of the Windsor and Coutts border blockades. But what she failed to note is that Stats Canada found that even despite the border being temporarily blocked at Windsor, the Ambassador Bridge, all the trucks went to the other bridges. So trade was, in fact, according to Stats Canada, when they studied it some months later, and you can Google this and see it, trade was actually, the crossing trade was up by 16%. So this whole idea, it was purely a model they came up with that if no trucks could cross at all, this is what the impact could be. The fact of the matter is the trucks went to the other two bridges that are there. Similarly, at Coutts, they rerouted to Delmeda and then the other crossing. So there was a temporary impact, no greater than a day. But the reason I almost spit out my coffee was every day I get emails from people who've lost their businesses, who've lost their homes, who've lost their families because of the government's overreach with these mandates. Look at the economic costs to the tourism sector alone from the prolonged government travel mandates that prevented foreigners from coming to Quebec to see the beautiful sights, going to Alberta and British Columbia and all those tourism dollars. It was many, many tens of billions of dollars. So they're being a little selective here. right? They're first of all jacking up the numbers about the economic impact,
Right.
and they're completely willfully blind, I would suggest, to the economic impact that their own travel mandates had. I got to give another example. A lot of people don't understand this. When they brought in the vaccine requirement to travel by air in Canada, which no other G7 country did, we were unique in that respect of overreach. It also required the baggage handlers, the security clearance people, the people who work at Booster Juice and Starbucks, to all be vaccinated as well. So the disruption and the delays, if you traveled at all even recently, you're still feeling the effects where you pull up and you can't get up to the bridgeway because there's no baggage handlers or you're waiting for 2 hours. So the economic impacts of that they're willfully blind to. So it was remarkable that she was trying to vilify freedom protesters for their alleged economic impact, which Stats Canada said wasn't real, and completely ignoring the incredibly dreadful economic impact that this government policy of overreach had on the mandates.
I fully agree. You know, the border communities, the border cities through the pandemic have suffered tremendously because of all of those
Niagara
mandates.
Falls.
Yeah, exactly. You know, we saw some MPs are talking about it in the House of Commons, and I even have a graph right here. I just sent it on Slack if we can pull that up shortly. Canada had some of the strictest COVID-19 restrictions from all countries. You know, I compare it to Germany, Italy, Croatia, Iceland right here, and Canada from April 1st, 2021 to April 1st, 2022 is above all of the other ones. If we could put it up on the screen, that would be great. But what do you think of this testimony that Keith just talked to us about?
Well, my goodness, I'm sad to not have been able to see that myself or to hear it, but I think I just would have been very, very angered, as I honestly am right now, because, you know, it's like a bunch of bullies, literally just picking and choosing which places get to stay open and which ones get to close. And because for less than a day, they had some impacts, they're throwing a huge fit and making up all these statistics to try and, again, like you said, vilify the convoy when again, it was how many local businesses closed, but Walmart was allowed to stay open, but Costco was allowed to stay open. Liquor stores, weed, what are they?
LCBO.
I think they call
Cannabis.
it cannabis.
Cannabis, sorry,
Yes.
cannabis.
We're in Ontario.
Yeah, both, whatever. I don't smoke, so I'm not I'm not familiar with the terms, but all these places that the government runs or has some sort of hand in were allowed and able to stay open. Well, small business were impacted. Like you said, people lost their houses, people lost their lives to this. And now they're just throwing a huge fit. And there's no reason why it can't be justified. And the fact that they have to make up false statistics to try and make this narrative, I mean, it's just, they're digging their own grave here. And the closer we get towards the end of this, the worse it looks on them. It already was bad. It was already very, very, very bad. But what do you think is going to be like the impacts?
Well,
Really?
there's one more that I have to share with you that she said today, because I know you guys are busy here.
No.
The second thing she said that
done.
would have caused me to, what's that?
I said you weren't done.
No, I was not done.
Oh, goodness.
But she said that the other concern that Global Affairs or Foreign Affairs Canada had, get ready for this. She was and the government and the Prime Minister were very concerned about how Canadian flags were appearing in Australia and in the United States and protests in Europe and Central America. Then she said, because it was desecrating the Canadian flag, that these other Freedom protesters were flying the flag of Canada in Europe and in the United States and Australia, because it was being used to promote illegality. And that's why you'll see when you get a chance to see Mr. Miller's cross. But people were flying the Canadian flag in pride of true north, strong and free. We believe in governments following the law, the rule of law, and respecting the charter that puts limits on the government's ability to arbitrarily take away Canadians' fundamental rights and freedoms such as the right of mobility. So people weren't flying those flags in support in other countries in support of some kind of, criminal enterprise or organized crime or something silly. They were flying that flag in support and being proud of Canadians who had come forward to say to government, you've gone too far, you need to stop, and you need to follow the law. And they use this disinformation thing. There's a perfect example of a senior government official at the highest level under oath engaging in disinformation. They seem to be thinking they have this monopoly on who can characterize the truth. So, and I guess we'll be dealing with more of that next week.
No, of course it's ridiculous. And, you mentioned mobility rights, and in Quebec, there were people in high school that will literally run at the end of the day after hanging out with their friends. Even people in university, they would take their bike and they would run back to their home because they knew the curfew was about to arrive at 8 p.m. or 9 p.m. And they're not allowed to be outside after this hour. It's pathetic to think that the government was actually able to do that during the pandemic. Never would I thought that this was something that would happen in our lifetime. And then you mentioned the Canadian flag being flown overseas and people not being proud of that. How ridiculous is that?
Yes.
Aren't you supposed to be proud of your country?
Yes.
Aren't you supposed? Shouldn't the Prime Minister like to see Canadian flags everywhere because that's value in Canada? In the United States, Americans are proud to see the American flag everywhere. Have we just lost all sense of nationalism?
No, it's because of what the flag stood for.
Yeah.
Because people that were flying that flag stood in solidarity with people in the convoy, that stood in solidarity with putting up a protest against these unjust mandates and vaccine, the passports, all the restrictions, everything that they did. It served as a big source of inspiration, and it happened all over the world. That's exactly what it inspired the convoys in the U.S. and Australia. They were in Italy, they were in the Netherlands. And there was a mini convoy that came up from Calgary, Alberta, and went up to Edmonton, to the legislature building there, just to show that the Canadians here stood in solidarity with the Dutch farmers that are protesting the insane. I can't say that word. The WEF and their crazy cutbacks on emissions. It's just literally. I mean, you're gonna eat the bugs, Will.
Yeah,
and you're gonna love it.
Yeah, Klaus Schwab's globalist agenda. All right, we'll go back to Brendan Miller and we'll talk about Rob Kitteridge. But right before we go to another Miller clip, I want to show a picture that I was sent earlier today. Rob Primo made that great picture, that great little graphic about Brendan Miller. If you could show that on the screen, yeah, it's Miller times. When Brendan goes like this.
Oh, they're in for it. You just see it.
Something's happening. You know, when the shoulder pads go to the side and when you see him getting ready to continue his cross-examination, something's coming in this graphic. As a
litigator, I can tell you when he does that, he's got you right where he needs you to be, and it's not going to matter what you do. You are done. You are coming out of the cage on his terms, and that's it. So
it's like an anaconda snake.
When he does this, you're done.
Oh yeah, and it. Everyone knows it. All right, Brendan Miller, a little quick honor to you. Let's take a look at clip number 6. Another clip from Miller time. He's got his whole cross-examination today was great. Rob Kitteridge was nice as well, I think. And I look forward to seeing what comes up for the rest of the week and what comes up next week when he testify a little Transport Minister Omar Al-Jabra when he appears in front of the commission. Let's take a look at clip number 6.
He stated that at no point did the service, being CSIS, assess the protests in Ottawa or elsewhere, those referred to as the Freedom Convoy and related protests and blockades in January and February 2022, constituted a threat to the security of Canada as defined in Section 2 of the CSIS Act, and that CSIS cannot investigate activities constituting lawful protests. CSIS assessed there was no indication of foreign state interference occurring in the course of the protest. CSIS did not assess that any foreign state supported the protest through funding, that foreign states deployed covert or overt disinformation techniques, or that any foreign state actors attempted to enter into Canada to support the protest. There, Director Venus states that he learned that the EA referenced the threat definitions set out in Section 2 of the CSIS Act once the federal government began to seriously consider invoking the EA between February 10th and 13th. He requested that the service prepare a threat assessment on the risks associated with the invocation of the EA. He felt an obligation to clearly convey the service's position that there did not exist a threat to the security of Canada as defined by the service's legal mandate. The threat assessment prepared by the service was that the invocation of the emergencies legislation risked further inflaming IMV rhetoric and individuals holding accelerationist or anti-government views. You were told that, is that correct?
That is correct.
Well, that basically just goes back to what we were saying earlier, that's the evidence, but he mentioned it multiple times. What a great testimony by Brendan Miller. What did you think of this line?
I think you can only hear something so many times. And that's pretty much it. Like, can you imagine saying it point blank and then just, for the people in the back, like literally screaming, like, do anything except this, do anything except, poke the snake, so to speak. Keith?
Well, and I think you might have touched on this a little bit earlier with your lawyer who was sitting in this chair. I think he works for Law and Order or Suits. I'm not sure.
Something like that. Yeah,
exactly.
He's definitely, well, I think he was an extra in Suits.
Oh,
Yeah, well,
so
you know my
You can
boss.
say that
I thought he looked familiar.
Yeah, he could say that he played one on television. So
That
he's
is
not a real
right.
lawyer, but he played one on television. But, he was pretty accurate, but I'll give it a little bit more King's Counsel precision. It's this. The question in law, when a decision maker invokes these kind of powers, is what information did they have in front of them to justify their decision? And was it reasonable? And all of the experts, as we've talked about, have testified that the trigger thresholds were not met. The evidence wasn't there. So today was the first time we heard what the new narrative is.
Mm-hmm.
And from the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, he said that it was for the Prime Minister and his cabinet to adjudicate and make a decision as to whether they thought that the legal test was met, despite all of the experts, all of the intelligence agencies, all of the police forces telling them it wasn't. And then, of course, that opened up for Brendan Miller to say, and what training does the Prime Minister have in law enforcement, beyond
Drama teacher,
beyond playing a police officer in a play in high school or something?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it didn't matter what the answer is because we all know none. So it's not looking good for the government. And it's really good for Canadians that we're getting to see how corrupt the Trudeau government is.
Well, I think that he had as much training as Tom Marazzo had when he played a lawyer, when he played an FBI agent in the series. But it was Designated Survivor. If you guys haven't watched, it's a great series. And also, just go back on Suits. Anyone who watched Suits, basically the whole plot is a lawyer who's never went to law school, who actually becomes a lawyer. And well, I think that could be Tom Marazzo. Do you think he's got the
I hadn't
talent?
thought of that. Yeah.
So just to go back, I'm not sure if we had the clip ready. I just sent it. Brendan Miller, in his first statement at the commission, his opening statement was short. It was 2 minutes long, but it was super concise and precise and brief. And it was a great opening statement, a great testimony, a great statement. Sorry. He said that we will see no evidence whatsoever that the Freedom Convoy met the threshold for Section 2 of the CSIS Act. Let's take a look exactly what Brendan Miller said back then.
Good morning. My name is Brendan Miller of Foster LLP, and I am counsel to Freedom Corp, which is an organization that represents the protesters of which attended Ottawa in January and February of 2022. My colleague, Ms. Beth Sheba Vandenberg of Foster LLP, is my co-counsel on this matter, as well as the solicitors of record, both Mr. Keith Wilson, King's Counsel, as well as Ms. Eva Chipiuk, who is counsel to the Convoy. With respect to sort of everyone's given an overview of the theory of their case, it is our view that there was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act requires several things. One, it could be invoked due to espionage and sabotage. Are you going to hear any evidence about espionage and sabotage? The answer to that is no. Two, it could be invoked on the basis of clandestine or deceptive foreign influence, or foreign influence that involves a threat to a person. Are you going to hear evidence about that? The answer to that is no. It also could be invoked on the basis of threats or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property. Are you going to hear evidence of violence against persons or property? The answer is no. Lastly, it can also be invoked if there is a group or persons trying to destroy or overthrow by violence the system of government of Canada. Are you going to hear evidence about individuals trying to do that? The answer is no. And the answer is that there was no reasonable and probable grounds to invoke the Emergencies Act, and that the government exceeded their jurisdiction, both constitutionally and legislatively, in doing so. Thank you.
Brendan Miller is also a law instructor at Wilfrid Laurier University. He teaches constitutional law. I think that was just a lecture right here, basically. And everything he said back then so far is true. I wasn't in the room when he said that, but when he's standing in front of all the lawyers who are anti-Convoy, who are pro-Emergencies Act, when he's standing in front of Paul Cham, when he's standing in front of the government of Canada, I can't imagine their face when he just hears, when they just hear him blast Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act and say why it was wrong. And so far, the evidence corroborates the statement.
Each of his statements have so far proven to be true. Mm-hmm. And as you've pointed out, both of you, each day we're just reminded of it yet again.
Yeah, it's just, Celine said it best the first time. It's the same thing. It's the same thing every single day. Every day we just feel like we're repeating ourselves. But it's true.
Yeah.
But I think this week you're going to hear us repeat ourselves a little bit less. Because there's going to be a lot more interesting details, a lot more interesting testimony. And by the way, back then, his hair looked different. Is it just me or?
Oh, no, he's Eva took him for a makeover.
So that's why. That's why. What did you think of this opening statement?
I mean, it's right there. It's literally everything that we've seen. That's why I said, I'm like, we just keep on repeating ourselves. And I really wish that I didn't start every single live stream with, well, this is what we know. And we've been hearing the same thing. It's tiny little pieces of evidence, new information that come in, of course, and it's different people testifying. But all in all, we're here to see if Justin Trudeau and his decision to pull the plug and hit the panic button and invoke the Emergencies Act was justified. And so far, absolutely nobody has said yes. So again, he said that from the beginning. Honestly, I hadn't seen that until now. So if I saw that in the beginning, I would have just been like, well, that's enough. Just put him here. Just have him just show that speech every single day. Just remind everyone what's going to happen when we get to that finish line. That is just a couple weeks away, really.
I think that CSIS is getting a little bit tired of listening to us talking about the same thing every single day. They want more information. They want new information to catch us on. If you're listening, CSIS, I know it's the same thing, but you're going down. Keith, Rob Kitheridge, I don't know if you followed his cross-examination of the witnesses earlier this morning. He brought up the LRB, a document that showed that the New Democratic Party was in with the Emergencies Act prior to it being invoked, that they were going to vote in favor of it. Can you tell us a little bit more about that document? I don't know if we have the clip. If we have the clip, it would be great. But can you tell us a little bit more about that? Sure.
So it was a briefing document in advance of the vote, setting out what the position of the Conservatives would be on the anticipated vote to invoke the Emergencies Act, what the position of the Liberals and the Bloc and the NDP. And the Conservatives and the Bloc would to be opposed and the NDP to support. And so the question is, how did they know that ahead of the vote? And this Liberal Research Bureau is something I didn't even know existed, but it's a little propaganda branch that's within the Liberal Party, but situated here in Ottawa and seems to have direct access to all bureaucracies and things political. And it seems to be, from what I've been reading in the document disclosures, where some of these highly manipulative plans are developed and concocted and tested. And Yeah, it's you're going to see a lot more about the Liberal Research Bureau, the LRB, in later this week and next week for sure.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking as well. We're going to hear a lot more about those, so definitely stay tuned for that. Just a quick reminder, guys, if you want to chat with us, if you want to tell us something that you want us to read on air, you can always head on to Rumble or Odyssey, and you can send us a paid chat that we will do our best to read on air later. Liberal Research Bureau, just to go back to that a little bit, because we're going to hear about it, so I think it would be great to know exactly what it is. From my understanding, it's not exactly a public servant like the Liberal MPs are public servants. It's a corporation associated with the Liberal Party. Am I right or am I wrong?
Yeah, it's not, from what we've been able to determine so far, it's not a formal, it's a branch of the Liberal Party of Canada.
I see.
And so it's clearly a partisan group of workers, political workers within the Liberal Party that manage political strategies and preposition the party for some of its antics.
I see.
Yes.
So yeah, so we're gonna hear more about it later this week. The Liberal Research Bureau.
Yeah,
that'll definitely be interesting. So
and who else are we going to hear from this week? Commissioner Lucky.
Oh yeah, tomorrow.
Yes, that's going to be
CSIS,
fascinating.
That's going to be very fascinating. Yeah, I'm excited for that.
One of the somewhat funny things today was when they were getting into a discussion about information versus intelligence. And the two senior government officials today were unable to really make a distinction between intelligence and information. And one of the things that they acknowledged they had an intelligence deficit on was what exactly the protesters in Ottawa wanted.
Right.
And someone whispered in my ear, it might have been Tom Marazzo. Why didn't they just come and meet with the protesters and ask them what they wanted if they realized they had an intelligence deficit for that?
Oh boy.
Anyway,
well, I think we always had the saying, you don't negotiate with terrorists, but they negotiated with Omar Khadr. So I'm not exactly sure if that's actually something they still follow nowadays. And you guys weren't terrorists; they saw you allegedly as domestic terrorists. But there's something that you said: difference between intelligence and information. The two senior officials had trouble making a difference, distinguishing one from the other. Can you tell us what's the difference between both?
Well, I don't know that there's a huge difference. I mean, one, they talked about information as it's sort of out there, and intelligence is somehow
classified,
something that's obtained.
Mm-hmm.
And the more they talked, the more foolish they were sounding. And I really started to think they were talking about a distinction without a difference. Just this language to make them sound more important, and their, CSIS to sound more sophisticated than it is, and things like that. It was, there was no sudden, revelation like, oh, that's why you invoked it through any of it. And the other thing that was a little embarrassing for the government today was when Brendan Miller cross-examined them on their own knowledge of the different thresholds. And they just said, we don't know. So you're the one advising on whether or not a threshold is met, and you don't know what the thresholds are?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, no, of course. And CSIS, they're going to be testifying today, not today, sorry, this week. And from what I understand, we've been talking a lot about it in the past week with Eva, even gave us a little rundown about that. But for those that are joining us today for the first time, that are new to this, I believe that Judge Rouleau made a decision to have an ex parte in-camera testimony for some of the CSIS evidence, some of the CSIS testimony, which would mean, from my understanding, that the public and the journalists won't be able to see what is said during the inquiry. Am I right? Can you explain a little bit more?
It's further than that, nor will we as legal counsel be allowed to be in the room.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it'll be CSIS in the room with commission counsel and counsel, probably, I would expect, from the government of Canada, telling what the big secret is. And then Rouleau, Justice Rouleau, or Commissioner Rouleau, as he is now, will make a decision after hearing that evidence as to whether or not he believes it is actually secret. In other words, it's of highly sensitive nature. I don't know, maybe they figured out what Tamara Leach's favorite fruit is or something, and they don't want the world to know. I don't know. But I certainly didn't see anything secretive or anything that would need to be kept secret in all of the interactions I had on the ground when I was here for 19 days during the protest, advising the protesters and providing them with legal advice. So it's going to be very interesting. And if it turns out, and I just hope this doesn't happen, but if it turns out that Justice Rouleau says, what I heard in the in-camera session was so profound that it justifies the invoking of the Emergencies Act, but I can't tell you what it is.
Exactly. I know.
We will all be saying the same phrase, whitewash. This will just be a complete whitewash. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Justice Rouleau is going to sell his judicial soul that easily.
But it's good that we're talking about that, right? It is good to just actually put it out there, I think, because I've thought about that. I was like, are they allowed to just say like, oh, by the way, it's totally justified, makes total sense, but we're never going to tell you why. Then what happens? Right? What was this the past 4 weeks for? What was it worth flying people out to come and give testimonies if this entire time CSIS had some sort of crazy revelation, that they just kept hidden behind a veil until the second last week before the very end of this? It's a little scary.
Yeah, and I think in terms of probabilities, there's not a lot of probabilities that happens.
No, he's remained very impartial. Yeah, Rouleau has remained really impartial up until this point, but maybe devil's advocate.
It would be the opposite of transparency.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, Justin Trudeau knows a lot about that. Big sock wearing national drama teacher, knows a lot about transparency. Socks are so nice.
I love his sparkly socks.
All right, before we get going, there's just one last clip that I want to show. Clip number 9. The last clip that we have from today is a clip where Rob Stewart testified that, quote unquote, the protests diminished and that goes beyond useful when he spoke about the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So he basically said that it was more than useful. He's the first one that we actually hear say that. Very interesting, to give the other side of the story. He did admit later that it was useful, but not necessary, but just to actually give him a fair representation. Let's take a look at clip number 9.
Numerous witnesses from the OPP and the OPS have testified that the invocation of the act may have been helpful, but it was not necessary to clear the protests. Would you agree with them on that point?
I believe that the invocation of the act provided very useful tools to law enforcement.
Useful tools, but not necessary tools.
Well, I'm not in a position to render an opinion on that. I don't think. I would only observe, as I've observed already, that upon the invocation of the act and the use of those tools, the protests diminished and stopped. And that goes beyond useful.
He still didn't say necessary. I don't think beyond useful means necessary, Keith.
Well, there was a example of a senior government bureaucrat trying to save his job. But let's like peel this back and remove the fog. Everything that they did in Ottawa, they had the ability to do under existing statutes. Everyone who was charged with an offense in Ottawa was charged under the criminal code, not a new law, not the Emergencies Act. The only thing that was unique was the freezing of the bank accounts. I know, because I am legal counsel to many of them who had their bank accounts frozen, I can tell you the precise number of protesters that left Ottawa because their bank accounts were frozen. 0. It didn't cause them to leave. And even if they wanted to leave, most of them could only go as far as the amount of fuel they had in their vehicle because they couldn't get gasoline because their debit cards, their credit cards were all frozen. So there's no evidence that it was even, what was the phrase he used? It was helpful or something?
Beyond useful.
Oh, beyond useful. Beyond. There's like Beyond Meat Burger. So the fact of the matter is, so many of the senior police officials, the deputy ministers, the city managers have all testified that they had secured a contract for tow trucks before they had, that's why we've had all this discussion about tow trucks. They had the powers under the They had an agreement for tow trucks, but in addition to that, because they had invoked the state of emergency in Ontario, that triggered their ability to commandeer tow trucks. Similarly, as was corrected today in the testimony from the lawyer cross-examining the federal government for the government of Alberta, that in fact, under the Alberta Emergency Management Act, similarly allowed them, and that's how they got tow trucks there. So it wasn't tow trucks, it wasn't offenses, and the only thing they can point to is the bank account freezes, and no one left because their bank account was frozen, and even if they wanted to, they couldn't.
Yeah.
So this is all about Prime Minister Trudeau being furious that blue-collar, hardworking, diverse Canadians were calling him out, exposing his un-Canadianness, and looking for the biggest tool, that he had in terms of being able to discipline and show his disapproval to these Canadians seeking to have the charter and the rule of law respected. And that's what this is just absolutely clearly about as each day goes by.
Well, Canadians who were opposing him. That's what it was about.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. We're already past time. I just have one last question for you, Celine, and Keith, you as well. So next week, if we don't take into consideration Justin Trudeau, who are you most excited to see testify in front of the Public Order Emergency Commission? Among, we're going to see David Lametti, Marco Mendicino, Omar Al-Jabra, Bill Blair, Anita Agnat, Chrystia Freeland, some more. So who are you most excited to see?
Chrystia Freeland. Yeah. And I'd say Omar as well, being that he is the Minister of Transportation, and how that was, I can't use that word either, how this was very dysfunctional on their end. And we've seen it from all the deputy ministers and absolutely every other person in governance of those areas at Windsor, etc. So yeah, I can't wait to see them just honestly at a loss for words. I really can't imagine the lengths that they're going to have to go to conjure some sort of excuse. I mean, maybe, we'll have someone be like, well, I have a lot of mental health issues actually. And, I can't actually give you an excuse beyond the fact that some people just to get out of something, right? You go to get charged at the stand and you're like, actually, I'm schizophrenic. So, clean the board. I'm fine. Everything's fine. I'm not sure how they're going to retain their positions. I'm not sure how they're going to, in any way, shape, or form, be able to garner the respect or the trust from the Canadian people. Of course, I'm looking forward to it. Yeah.
Chrystia Freeland for you. What about you, Keith?
Every single one of them being cross-examined by Brendan Miller, and looking forward to the moment he does this. So that's
Miller
what
time.
I'm looking for.
Well, I think for myself, my best friend Omar Al-Jabra, the transport genius. Our genius is in charge of our transportation system, which is why our transportation system is so absolutely horrendous. This wizard of transportation.
It's so good. What are you talking
about? I can't wait. Yeah, exactly. I can't wait to see this little man testify and being cross-examined by Brendan Miller. All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Keith. We'll definitely see you soon. See you very soon again. And there's a lot of stuff we didn't talk about today, but we still talk about a lot of things, but there are a lot of things that happen today. So if you enjoyed this live stream, come back tomorrow at the same time, 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. We go through everything that happens during the day, and we'll even go back on some of the things that took place today that I didn't get the chance to touch on. So yeah, if you have any idea, if you have any topics that you want me to touch on, you can always leave it in the comment section, and I'll try to take a look at that. Thank you for your time, Celine. Thank you once again, Keith, and to everyone, have a great evening.